prologue to my new book, 70 times 7. On a spring afternoon in 1985 in Gary, Indiana, 4 teenage girls enter the home of an elderly woman under false pretenses, and when they leave, she is dead. One of them, a 15-year-old, will soon be sentenced to death for murder. There is no question of her guilt. This is not a story of wrongful conviction. The crime was violent enough to shock the conscience, a legal phrase the prosecutor invokes, and so no voices of protest will rise up in that city or in broader Lake County or farther south in the capital at the impending execution of a 10th grader. Not until a man very close to the victim, her grandson, publicly forgives the girl against the wishes of his family and campaigns to spare her life. Not until the crime is featured on the front pages of newspapers and television programs 5,000 miles away, across the ocean, where petitions are signed by millions, does the American media begin to question the outcome of this case. A tragedy in a Midwestern steel town will continue to play out, have its second act, as far away as the Vatican. From criminal court in northern Indiana, the reverberations of the case will eventually be felt in the highest court of the United States. Over the past 5 years, I have read thousands of pages of documents, personal letters, and newspaper features, and scanned through thousands of photographs and dozens of hours of footage. I've conducted interviews with some 80 individuals, culminating in hundreds of hours of conversation. Throughout, I was asking myself about the nature of belief, of conviction, the source of our guiding principles. I have asked myself what our common definition of justice might be, if there is even a shared understanding of the word. Unlike some of the people whose lives and choices I will describe here, I am not a practicing Christian, but I have returned again and again to a moment from the Gospel of Matthew that has special meaning for someone at the center of this story. The moment when the disciple Peter asks Jesus how many times he should forgive those who harm him. The answer is 70 times 7, an enormous number, as if Jesus were suggesting his followers be prepared to forgive an infinite number of times. It is hard to imagine someone who could carry this out. It is hard to know if such a request is even fair. Anger is very human, instinctual response. The act of forgiveness, I think, is more alien and requires something tougher, a belief that none of us is solely defined by the worst thing we have ever done, that each of us remains human, sometimes in spite of our actions, and that sometimes our actions are a response to forces larger than ourselves. This is a story that asks what any community is willing to accept as just consequences, as justice for harm done. It is a difficult question, one that each person in this book has been forced to confront. Because whatever the answer, its impact will be more sprawling than predicted, hard to contain. Whether or not we choose to acknowledge it, in ways very great or very small, the fates of neighbors are linked.
All right. So that gives a broad overview. And the place that I want to start is by talking about the creative choice that you make at the beginning of the book to tell the story not of the murder at the heart of the book, the crime at the heart of the book, but to tell a story about a suicide attempt. So I want to ask you about that and hear you talk about the mother, Gloria, and her 2 daughters in this car. It's a horrific scene, but this is the opening of your book, and I want to know about that choice.
Yeah. So, I think when people find out about this book and they're drawn to it, they know that it tells the story of a murder committed by this teenage girl. So how do you set that up? How do you start the narrative? And I think typically in a book that deals with a violent crime, you have the crime kind of up top, right? I wanted to go back in time in the life of this girl. And so instead, the opening is a moment in 1979 where these two young sisters are ushered out of their house by their mother and told to get into the garage and sit down in the sedan. And the mother closes the garage door and runs the car. And the plan is that she's going to end her life and end the lives of her daughters. Ultimately, the mother has a change of heart and carries the girls back into the house and goes out to finish the job on herself. And so the older sister, Rhonda, is left to call for help, to run to the neighbor's house, to run across the street to try to find someone who'll help them. And these two young sisters watch as their neighbors and then the paramedics, they come, they pull their mother out of the car, they lie her on the ground, different people try giving her CPR. And Paula, the younger sister, has a hysterical response. And then we kind of flash forward for just a moment in time to the older sister, Rhonda, telling me personally that she never really knew exactly the moment when her younger sister, Paula, changed. But she thinks now maybe it was at that moment. And so
Well,
the opening,
let me just interrupt you. How could you not change? I mean, my goodness, that is horrific. And I feel like any child, a young child going through something like that, watching their mother.
Well, what's incredible is they, you know, the kids were sent to live with an aunt for a little while. The mother checked herself out of the hospital in a couple weeks, went, picked up the girls, and nothing more was made of it, you know? So it's really interesting how little was made of that trauma at the time. And no one was really interested in the lives of these girls until Paula went on to commit this horrible crime at 15 years old. Then suddenly everyone wanted to know about their background. But there were a lot of opportunities for people to intervene, and they did not.
So let's talk about the crime itself, just so that listeners are completely oriented. A lot of people listening will not have had the chance to read yet. And the crime, as you say in the prologue, is not in question. This is not a book about did she do it or did she not do it. The question of guilt is clear. Paula Cooper murdered, I believe, 87-year-old Ruth Pelkey in Gary.
78, yeah.
I'm sorry, 78. I flipped the numbers. But yeah, a great-grandmother, a Bible studies teacher, and a sweet woman by all accounts. And I'd just like you to kind of set up and describe briefly the crime so that people can understand the stakes.
Yeah, of course. What happened is at Lew Wallace High School in Gary, Indiana, in May of 1985, a group of 4 girls who were between them 14, 15, 16 years old decided to skip class in the afternoon, and they went over to one of the girls' houses nearby. They were bored, and they wanted some money to get up to something. And one of the girls said, well, you know, this older woman lives right across the alley, and she teaches Bible studies, and she has a lot of nice things in the house. I've been over there. So, you know, why don't you guys just go and knock on the door and pretend like you're interested in Bible studies lessons or something, and maybe that'll be a way in. And one of them is, you know, she hands Paula a knife from the kitchen and says, well, you know, maybe you could threaten her with this. You could scare her. Ultimately, 3 of those 4 girls talk their way into the house, and it becomes kind of a robbery gone wrong situation, a home invasion. Paula snaps, and she hits this elderly woman over the head, and it escalates, and she uses the knife to stab her ultimately 33 times without provocation. And between the 4 girls, they came away with $10 and the keys to Ruth Pelkey, the victim's Plymouth, which they took for a ride. And, when news got out about this crime, it just sent shockwaves through the community, through Lake County, and ultimately through Indiana. People just couldn't believe it. And very quickly, within just a couple days, all 4 girls were arrested. And it hit the papers that this had been done not by seasoned criminals or adult drug addicts, but by 4 junior high school girls. And that was made it a truly sensational crime at the time.
This was 1985?
Yeah, 1985.
Okay. So this book hit home for me. I mean, it hits you emotionally no matter where you're from, but it hit me because I moved to the state of Indiana in 1986 as I was entering 6th grade. And I have to say, I have no recollection of this case. I guess I wasn't tuned in at that age to
Where were you in Indiana?
Like suburban Indianapolis, a town called Carmel. I don't know if you've ever been there, but
okay, no, but I spent time in Indianapolis for the book for sure.
Yeah,
I mean, it was Lake County's a couple hours away, and when it reached Indianapolis, it was in the papers, and it went all the way to the Indiana Supreme Court. But I don't think, as a young person, you would have been aware of it the way you would have had you been growing up in Lake County proper. There was this kind of idea that it made a statement about the decline of society, and also it played into racial tensions in the area. Lake County has a long history of segregation. Initially, it was segregation that was at the level of the Jim Crow South, and so you had these 4 Black girls entering the home of an elderly white Bible teacher in a neighborhood that had previously been an exclusively white neighborhood. And that was undoubtedly part of why the coverage was so robust.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think my memory of Indiana, and I've said this on this show multiple times before as like my childhood has come up, is that Indiana, I think in like the popular imagination anyway, racism is often thought to be super intense in the American South, going back to the Civil War and Jim Crow and all that kind of stuff. And I have often argued that the Indiana of my youth anyway had a sort of Southern flavor to it, despite the fact that its latitude is higher than Southern states, and that it was a very racist state. I felt that as a kid, and I don't know if it's changed in the intervening years. I left a long time ago. It's been 30 years now. Yeah, it's been 30 years. So I don't know if you picked up on that, but I would love for you to touch on that and then to paint for listeners a little bit better the city of Gary, Indiana, which is up north near Chicago. And as you just mentioned, has a difficult history racially, but also economically. So it's a tough town, Gary, Indiana.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's this interesting thing in the North where we think that I say we because I'm a born and raised New Yorker, but we think that somehow because we're in the North, there's less of a legacy of racism. And a lot of Black families and workers in the Great Migration left the South and migrated up to these industrial cities. Gary was founded as a city in the early 1900s. They went up there looking for work at the mills like everybody else. It was a great opportunity, only to find that you couldn't live in the same neighborhood. Your house wasn't going to have plumbing or access to clean water. You couldn't go in the same park as a white person. I mean, it goes on, and the only jobs available would be the worst and the riskiest jobs at the mill. It was a city that was really laid out around this new Gary Works U.S. Steel mill on the waterfront, and it was laid out exclusively for the white executives of the mill. And beyond that, the roads kind of stopped, and real estate became much more improvised. And immigrants, whether they came from European countries or Black migrants from the South, they ended up in these really crappy, improvised kind of shantytown areas. And the city grew in that way, and so there was this imbalance built into it from the beginning. With Gary, there was a combination of factors that really messed the city up. The dependence on the mill, there was a loss of a lot of steel jobs in the 70s and the early 80s. And so that depressed the city. But there was, even before that, a Black mayor was elected because half the city was eventually Black, Mayor Richard Hatcher. And he ran on a campaign of equal access to quality housing and essentially a civil rights platform. He refused to work with the white Democratic machine in the typical corrupt fashion. He had an agenda that he believed was a humanitarian and essential one, and he went for it, and he was elected. And that, combined with economic depression, just led to white flight. There was an absolute white panic about a Black mayor. The city is becoming Black. I mean, truly classic kind of stuff. And so businesses moved into the suburbs. And so the suburbs became, this booming, wonderful, real estate rich place to be. Shopping malls open there. Everything was drained from Gary. And so you can go there today and see what could still be, in some imagined scenario, a beautiful downtown. You see these old buildings on Broadway. It was built for that to be this vibrant downtown, and it's a ghost town. So I really don't think there's a way to bring Gary back, even though there was there was an incredible thriving Black community there. The Jackson Five grew up there and would play in some of the local clubs, which has like a short shout out in the book. I hope that someday actually someone from the area who grew up within the Black community will give a go at writing the definitive book on the life of that city. But that became the backdrop for this crime, right? And just gave a sense of some of the tensions in the background. And one of the ironies I'll also throw in is that the judge who ended up sentencing Paula Cooper to death was the first Black criminal court judge in all of Lake County in its history. And it was a big deal. He was also openly against capital punishment, and he took every opportunity he could to give people reduced sentences. And he just felt this girl got such poor legal representation. He had no grounds by which to avoid giving her the death sentence. And that was something he never recovered from.
That's Judge Kimbrough.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was a sympathetic character. He's somebody I felt like who, as you do, had a sense of the complexity of these kinds of cases and just maybe the human experience in general. And that is, I think, what your book is in large part a testament to. It's very easy, especially when a crime this horrific is committed, for the story to become sensationalized and simplified. And for many people, including maybe myself, I don't mean to denigrate people who read about these things in the press in the midst of their busy lives and just think, oh, awful, throw the book at them. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Like it can happen to anybody, but I do think people tend to, in the midst of their busy lives, not have time to investigate fully, or just reflexively want to avoid the details. And I'm curious, as a reader, how you got interested in this particular case and in the issue of capital punishment, and in particular, the issue of capital punishment as it pertains to teenage offenders.
Yeah. I mean, I think whenever I choose to pursue a story, it's through a connection to characters, so to speak, individual human lives, the people who draw me in, right? Less not so much a like a larger issue. So I was really drawn into this. I read about the case through some adjacent research I was doing, and it just stopped me in my tracks. And for two main reasons. One, the fact that this murder had been committed by a 15-year-old girl. Her age just shocked me, and the fact that she was sentenced to death at that age for the crime. But then also this other aspect, which is the choice of Bill Pelkey, Ruth's grandson, to then, a few months after her death sentence, to publicly forgive Paula and decide that actually, no, his grandmother would have wanted him to try to save this girl's life, not to allow someone to be executed in her name. And it is a tall order. I mean, I think I'm a generally good person, but it is a tall order to expect someone to go and forgive the person who murdered their loved one. And I really didn't know how I felt about that. So I looked him up. I looked Bill up and I said, do you have a second? I want to talk about this decision you made years ago. And I realized that I really wanted to grapple with that, because not only did he forgive her, he wrote a letter to the editor of this big local paper. He announced his decision to his family members and his friends and his coworkers. They all thought he was insane. But he also wrote a letter and looked up the address of, death row for Paula in Indianapolis, and just sat down one day at the steel mill where he worked, grabbed some printer paper from his foreman's office, got a pen, sat down on his break, and just thought, okay, what am I going to say to this girl on death row who murdered my grandmother? And he said, I just want you to know I'm thinking about you, and I forgive you. And if you're open to it, I kind of want to do what I can to help you out. And I want to tell you more about my family, and I want to know more about you. And it sparked an actual relationship that went on for years and years. And I was able to see hundreds of those letters and hundreds of more emails between them. And for me, that totally surreal, unique relationship that became the spine of the book, and a way into asking these much bigger questions.
I think it's also the heart of the book. If we're going to use if we're going to use the body metaphor, I mean, this Bill Pelkey character is quite something, and the relationship that he has with Paula Cooper, the murderer, is quite something. And I think it's worth describing the moment of revelation for Bill Pelkey. This because Paula Cooper is convicted, and I think at that point Bill is on board with her conviction and her sentence, and then the revelation happens months later, correct?
Yeah. What happened is, even, her public defender on a capital case decided several months in to change her plea to guilty without a deal on the table. I mean, that's an enormous risk. And so it came down to her sentencing hearing, and the judge felt pressured to go with the most extreme sentence available. And within a few months, having had some time to kind of digest this situation, Bill was called in on a late shift at the mill. He was a crane operator, which means he was kind of hovering above the mill where they pour out this sort of molten steel and turn it into slabs that are rolled up and sent out across the country to make cars and various other parts. But on the shift, no one else had shown up. So bizarrely, he's alone, hovering over the warehouse, and he starts thinking about everything that's going on in his life. There's the tragedy of his grandmother's death, but also his life at the time was a complete hot mess. His relationship was falling apart. He was bankrupt. He'd alienated a lot of his family for various reasons. And he just felt that he had disappointed so many people. And somehow this series of thoughts makes him start to cry. And he's thinking, it's sort of his emotions are escalating. And he has this transformative moment up in the crane where he thinks, you know what, one person I cannot, I can avoid disappointing is my grandmother. She would not have wanted us to get behind the killing of this kid as retribution, supposedly, for her death, right? I've got to do something about this. And he walks out of the mill that night feeling that he has, for the first time in his life, a calling, basically. You know, he was raised devout Baptist, was a Christian youth camp guy and wanted to become a pastor, but ultimately dropped it all because by the time he was in college, he realized he liked girls too much. He just didn't have a vision. He didn't have, he didn't have the calling. And, his life had sort of just kind of stumbled along since then. He was drafted in the war. He did time in the mill, and he went home, cashed his check. You know, this is not someone with a political consciousness, with a vision for his life whatsoever. And from that night forward, he suddenly had a kind of core meaning to his days, you know, and he was very much a lone ranger during that period. There was at first nobody who felt they understood his position. Everyone thought that he had basically had a breakdown. Poor Bill, he's really lost it. And it took a little while, but the force of his conviction ended up making people see, like, no, he's serious about this. And other people came to Paula's defense, and over time he began to get recognition as sort of a someone whose perspective was really valuable and powerful. If a victim's family member says they don't want the death sentence, then in a way, who's it for, right? Is that justice? How are we? Who are we executing this kid in the name of? What's the purpose of this? So I found him to be a totally fantastic character and person to try to get inside of.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that this revelation that he had at a low moment in his life, which is often when revelations tend to happen.
Right.
It's sustained, but it sustained itself. I mean, this is not something that was like a flash in the pan. This is something that for the rest of his days was the core of his existence and was his central mission, was to advocate for the abolition of the death penalty.
Yeah, it was also, you know, that kind of work on his part. So I should explain, you know, as Paula's appeal works its way through the system and it ultimately makes its way up to the Indiana Supreme Court. At the same time, Bill is, by speaking to the press about this case and against the death sentence, he ends up connecting with various other people who call themselves abolitionists. He doesn't even know what the word means, but it's people who are, of course, against the death penalty. I don't think he had known a single activist of any stripe in his life before that. And so he kind of starts taking part, like, okay, there's a rally. Maybe I'll go to a rally. And he's the only one every time showing up in a pressed suit, carrying a Bible. You know, everyone thought he was like the lone Christian Republican at the activist rally. But he ends up meeting along the way, slowly, one by one, other individuals who had lost family members to violence and who had also chosen to speak out against the death sentence in that case, who did not want death for the perpetrator, and who had also felt completely like pariahs, crazy people, total loners. And so he actually took part in assembling a collective of people all around the country who were in this position, and they end up calling themselves The Journey. And that ends up being this other plot line of the book that really, to me, was so phenomenal to explore. And I got to know a number of these individuals, and they're so they are brave and so fascinating to talk to. So that was kind of another outgrowth of this case, was this victims network.
Yeah, well, I think there are probably people listening who are thinking to themselves, like, wait a minute, you can execute a teenager in the United States of America? That might come as a surprise to some people who aren't tuned into this issue and maybe aren't like news consumers or high level news consumers. But in America, especially in the mid 1980s, there were multiple. I want to say, was it 27? I could be totally botching the number, but there were lots of teenagers, or a good number of teenagers, on death row.
Well, so at the time when Paula was sent to death row, there were, I think it was about 33
Okay.
juveniles in total on death rows around the country. By the time you got to the early 2000s, there were, I think it got as high as maybe like the low 70s, right? And it was what's, more important to understand, perhaps, is the fact that in the course of American history, we have executed more than 300 teenagers for crimes they committed. And since the 1970s, we'd sentenced more than 200 teenagers to death, right? So this isn't like an old time kind of problem that we're looking back on. And the book connects the dots between Paula's case and some of her attorneys all the way up to the end of the death sentence for teenagers, which wasn't until 2005. I mean, that was to, I was maybe in some abstract way aware that the same Supreme Court had handed down that decision back then, but this was the first time it struck me how up until how recently it was considered constitutional to execute a kid. And in some cases, so for instance, in Paula's situation in Indiana, when she was sentenced to death, no one in the state seemed to be making a big fuss about the fact that their minimum age for death was 10 on the books, 10 years old. And, it's one of those things where, okay, well, we're never going to execute a 10-year-old. What are you talking about? Why does it matter? Well, why is it on the books? Like, it was an issue that a few people in the wake of her sentence chose to step up and speak out about. You've got this state senator, Earlene Rogers, who was a longtime public school teacher in Gary.
By the way, I just got to say, I loved Earlene.
I'm so glad. Look,
yeah.
If you could hang out with her today in her 80s, she is the coolest. She's got the hip eyewear. She's brilliant. She speaks her mind. And she came from a Black family in Gary that was well known in the community. Her father had been kind of like a grassroots, self-made organizer and advocate for other guys at the mill where he worked. And she was inspired by him and became a public school teacher and then started running for office. And the day after Paula's death sentence, she did not miss a beat. She called a press conference. She was the first out of the gate and said, I'm pretty sure there's a lot we can't agree on, but I'm pretty sure we can agree that we shouldn't be killing kids. So I'm going to introduce a bill right away in the next session to raise the minimum age for the death penalty in this state because it's an outrage. And she told me that at the time she thought, look, I'm Black. I'm a Black woman. I'm a public school teacher. Potentially no one is going to listen to me, but I'm willing to risk what little political capital I've got for this. Like, let's do it. And it was also, the fact that she was a school teacher. She looked at these kids in her class and she had a daughter who was the same age as Paula. And she just thought, you've got to be nuts if you're talking about holding someone that age equally responsible for a crime as you would an adult. It's only people who are thinking in some sort of abstract, tough on crime kind of mindset are going to think that that's valid. So she's tough as nails and I love her.
Yeah. Well, and we should say too, in the context of her time and also in her state, I think it carries forward to today, maybe even more so, but Indiana's a very red state. So not only is she a Black woman in Congress from a tiny little blue zone in what is otherwise a very red and often very racist state. That needs to be said.
Yeah, it's really, years later, a future mayor of Gary made the statement, made a statement honoring Earlene Rogers. And she said, she's made so many waves as a representative from Gary, which a lot of people in our assembly treat like another planet. Right. Which is, it's just seen as this, it's a city, it's urban, quote unquote, which is like code for being a diverse community. Right. But, for me, there's this core tragedy to this book. I mean, there's this act of horrible violence, and the fact that this young girl committed it. I mean, how did she end up in that situation? She ends up on death row. This is intense material to grapple with and to live with as the writer for like 5 years. But ultimately, for me, it was about all of these characters cumulatively choosing to think and to act just a little differently than the norm. And what that added up to was, you know, those little bits of personal conviction and bravery that did end up resulting in greater protections for kids in this country. You know, the fact that we couldn't agree as a culture on whether or not it was officially cruel and unusual, you know, to use constitutional language, to execute someone under 18 is a lot to wrap your head around, you know. And when you simplify some of these issues, it just you know, makes you realize people just have to, sometimes you just have to stand up. And so I took a lot of comfort from some of these very strident people who I met along the way. Paula's one of her appellate attorneys, Monica Foster, actually went on, she was only a few years older than Paula when she ended up on the case, and Paula was on death row. And she went to visit her on death row, and she was a few years out of law school, totally green. And she thought, what situation have I ended up in? This girl could be some kind of animal. I mean, who commits this kind of crime? And instead, she was really moved by the girl that she encountered, who just was so clearly a kid, so clearly seriously depressed and overwhelmed, and thought that she could be dragged off to the electric chair at any moment. And it ignited something in Monica that gave an extra kind of drive to her work. Today, she's the federal public defender of Indiana and is still taking on some of the most challenging capital cases you can imagine. And she is just a whip. So spending time with some of these people was actually like the great pleasure of a book that was also, you know, heavy stuff to deal with.
Yeah. I mean, thank goodness. You would almost have to have. I don't think you could have endured had there not been people like, you know, Bill Pelkey and Monica Foster and Earlene, because there is so much humanity in this story, ultimately, so much tragedy, but also so much humanity. And some of the people that we've been talking about and some of the things that you've been touching on get to one of the principal storylines of this book and this story of Ruth Pelkey and Paula Cooper, and it's the political storyline. You mentioned James Kimbrough, the black judge in Lake County earlier, and there's another gentleman that I want to talk about with respect to the prosecution of Paula Cooper and her eventual conviction, and that is Jack. Help me with his name, Jack Crawford.
Oh, Brad, I was literally about to ask you, so, hey, what did you think of the prosecutor?
Yeah.
I'm very curious how he came across for you.
He came across as very human and tragic. And I think that's to your credit as a writer, because he could easily be cast in a lesser book and in a lesser telling as a villain. And I think as a reader, for me, I was like, oh, this is an error in judgment, because political ambition, personal ambition fueled a lot of the decisions that I feel like he made as a prosecutor in this case. You know, it's a weird game, politics. And I think at one point in the book, he talks about feeling an obligation to the citizens he represented, who were kind of loudly calling for the most extreme penalty. And that's one way of justifying pushing for the death penalty in the electric chair for a 10th grader. But I also feel like it ultimately haunted him. And you draw him as a very round character. This is a guy who felt genuine affinity for Black people in the Black community as an Irish American. Was a lover of like Bobby Kennedy, a guy who struggled with his faith. I mean, you can continue, you know his story better, but the point that I think we need to make is that there are explicitly political choices that go into a case like this, and that go into the fact that Paula Cooper wound up on death row.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I to go back to kind of the rendering of Jack Crawford in the book, I'll admit that early on, I assumed, I've got a lot on my plate with this project. I don't really need to spend much time with the prosecutor. He went for the death sentence aggressively. He went for the death sentence 22 times in his 10 years as prosecutor, got it 17 times, and initially when the 4 girls were arrested, he announced at a press conference, look, basically I'll go for capital charges for all 4 if I can, this is, but I thought that's all we need to know. Right. and then I stopped myself and I said, like, no, you know what? Every chance you have to talk to somebody, you've got to take it. So I reached out to him, and I thought it would just be, one short conversation. We ended up talking many times, hours and hours over the course of a number of years. And I realized how often you almost miss an opportunity, right? And with this project, I knew it was going to take a while. And so I just kept trying to come at it from different angles. And I saw, I can relate to Jack's ambition. He was one of the youngest prosecutors in Lake County history, if not the youngest. He had a hunger for attention and power. He had a lot of potential as a rising political star. But, as part of that, he really embraced this tough on crime ethos that, as still makes hay today. I mean, people win elections right now based on just vague language about being tough on crime, harsher sentences. They don't have to back this up with any kind of data. And at this point, we know that just a blanket approach that involves harsher sentencing does not deter people from committing serious crime. It doesn't make our communities safer. It's just an emotional button to press. It totally works, and Jack went for it. It's something that unites the Democrats and the Republicans. We will always have politicians on either side willing to sell out for that platform because it works.
To be tough on crime is something you hear coming from the mouths of politicians of every party and stripe. And what frustrates me so much about it is that it is very difficult to have nuanced positions on crime in the same way. Like, I think a related issue that is very much the same in terms of its political dynamics is defense spending. If you say,
interesting, yeah.
If you say, like, hey, listen, maybe we should rethink spending, $600 billion on national defense every year, well, then you're weak on national defense and you're making people less safe. It's the easiest issue for your opponent to then turn on you. And
in New York State, it's, or in New York City, it's funding for the NYPD, which has a multi-billion-dollar budget that is unrivaled. I mean, there is no police department in a city in the world that has the budget that we've got here. But it's exactly what you said. There's an opening to just accuse the opponent of being weak if you want to investigate that, if you want to look at those numbers. And our culture is, it's cowboy culture, to some degree at its heart. And so in the same way that talking about forgiveness or mercy in the context of criminal justice is seen as just totally foreign and wild, why would the family member of this victim be asking for a lesser sentence? That's obscene. Actually, one response Bill and a number of his Journey colleagues have been met with is, well, okay, well, what that says to us is that you didn't love your grandmother the way I love my brother or my grandmother or whatever. It's that you just don't have that emotional tie to that family member. That's why you're thinking that way, right? It's there's just not enough room for us to actually look at real solutions. That's the thing, is we could be building safer communities if we were willing to have an actual nuanced dialogue. But I mean, I think, like you said, Jack, today is, the book describes later on the trajectory that his life and his career took, and it takes, I won't give it away, but it takes a really, he really has a fall from grace, and I think ultimately he wonders why he doesn't have the political legacy that he dreamed of, and he wonders what might have happened if he had taken a different tack as prosecutor. And it was so fascinating to be able to speak in depth with someone who had sat in that chair. I don't think you meet that many prosecutors who are willing to publicly analyze their decisions. He's retired, but I mean, I was told by a number of people who'd been on his team, former deputy prosecutors, that, in general, you never, I mean, to have a case, to have your sentence reversed, the way Paula's sentence was commuted publicly, I mean, publicly to the point where there are headlines in Europe about her sentence being reversed, is a level of humiliation professionally for a prosecutor that no one can handle. It's just not compatible with the role. There isn't a culture of saying, oh, well, you know what? I get it. You know what? That seemed like justice at the time. The public and the courts have decided otherwise. I'll take it. It's not like that. That is not the culture in the role of prosecutor. That is seen as a failure, and it's used against you. That's the mentality. So there's no way, to some level, there's no way to evolve in that role, And it was really fascinating to hear from people on the inside of that part of the process, speaking openly because some time had gone by.
Yeah, I mean, like, we talk about the politics of capital punishment, the politics of this case. We should mention that capital punishment is a rarity on planet Earth. Most countries don't kill people for committing crimes, even the most serious of crimes. And this particular case, in a flyover state in the United States, in a smaller town, smaller city, garnered ultimately the interest of people all over the world, particularly in Italy. And as you mentioned in the prologue, all the way up to the Vatican. Pope John Paul II, in the end, wound up weighing in on this case and lobbying for the commutation of Paula's sentence and to spare her life.
Oh, there's a fascinating moment when I realized, Paula, there's the role of correspondence in this story was really fascinating, because if you're in prison, never mind on death row, right? Writing letters at the time, I mean, before email, it's your lifeline to the world. And Paula's case was so sensational that she had pen pals. Like, I have no idea how many. Every day, all day, she wrote letters. And this was someone who'd gone to 10 different schools before the 10th grade, skipped class most of the time. She became a real writer just through the process of reaching out, responding. So she had correspondence all over the world, especially in Italy, as you mentioned. And at some point, one of her attorneys says, okay, here's what you're going to do. I want you to write a letter directly to Pope John Paul II. At that point, some representatives of the church, including a Franciscan friar in the burlap hooded robe and everything, had already shown up to visit her on death row. They knew there was interest from the church in supporting her. So she writes, Dear Holy Father, in this very girly, curly, cursive script. And the attorney gives this letter to the Pope, to an Italian journalist he's met along the way, who ends up as part of the press contingent that gets on what was called by the press Shepherd One, the Pope's personal plane, hands it to the Pope's number one guy. And so at a certain point, this piece of paper from this teenage girl on death row in Indiana ends up being passed into the hands of Pope John Paul II. I mean, it's just so wild to be able to go back and trace this. And the Pope ultimately, through his press person, makes a statement publicly that he would like to see her sentence commuted. And on top of that, he starts kind of going through the different archbishops in the region, to try to kind of influence the public, and certainly like the Catholic public. So the way in which this story has all of these different layers was so fascinating. And the way in which, on a human level, you've got a teenage girl who has no family behind her except her one sister, no support network. I mean, she's a reject, she's a pariah, she's on death row, she's uneducated. She makes herself into someone who can advocate for herself, even in that desperate situation, to the point where, I mean, it's just fascinating. Journalists are writing her from Holland. She's got fans in Scandinavia. I mean, I saw some of these letters, and she had ultimately a couple million letters and petitions sent to the Indiana Supreme Court and to Governor Orr of Indiana, protesting her death sentence. So that's a lot of power ultimately for one teenage girl with a crappy past.
No kidding. I was moved by her intelligence. She's clearly a very bright kid who just never had a shot. Like, did not have the support, did not have the family or the access to education that more fortunate children do. And had she had that, it seems pretty clear that she would have thrived. She was somebody with a lot of native intelligence. I should also say that your book is unflinching in sharing with readers some of the letters she wrote when she was not at her best. And they can be pretty chilling. They can be pretty chilling, these letters, where she's feeling sorry for herself. She has, I mean, and we should also flag the fact that she was like 16 years old, that she's a kid still writing these letters, and not really having any kind of level of appropriate sensitivity to the fact that she murdered a woman in cold blood. And I think these are letters maybe that she's writing with Bill Pelkey that you're sharing. I forgive me if my memory is wrong, but I want to say that.
I think you're right. Yeah. That's predominantly where I saw evidence of that. She has the maturity sometimes of someone who's been through the ringer. Before committing the crime, she had really been through it, shuttling between emergency shelters and foster homes, running away, being put in juvie,
abused, physically abused
by her
abused.
father, and emotionally abused. Her mother was a hard drinker. There were just a lot of aspects that were really tough. And then she's in, and then she ends up on death row. And so that's kind of brings with it, to some degree, like a level of maturity. But at the same time, she is a kid. And with that comes a kind of brattiness and volatility that any teenager displays, never mind someone with her background. So at some point, early on, she's writing letters to Bill. What your family needs to understand is ... right?
Right.
I'm the only one who's ever been through anything. Stuff that's, I'd love to take your dad and, tell him the way it really is. Just strident stuff that's totally inappropriate. I think I wanted to show all of that because she's a teenage girl, and that was real. And even the people who knew her and loved her were like, yeah, if you try to portray her as some kind of angel, it's just going to be a lie. I mean, she was a human being. Even Paula herself at one point is writing to the ACLU, advocating on her own behalf, saying like, the thing is, in this country, they want you to be an angel before they spare your life. And I can't figure that out. So basically, like, what do you want from me? I'm never going to live up to that. So maybe I'm screwed. Like, that's essentially the takeaway. But I think that I wanted to embrace the complexity of her as a character and as a human being. And this is we talked about this earlier. It's not a case of wrongful conviction. The reader has to accept this person absolutely committed this crime, and the crime was terrible. And now you have to wrestle with your own feelings about that. And, the fact that she's a kid has to be weighed against also the violence of the crime. It's not one way or the other. I think as a moral reckoning for the reader, there's a lot going on there. And I think different people will have different responses to the book, but hopefully, ultimately, you're able to see how her life led to that moment. She made a choice, but I mean, did she? I don't know. It's hopefully there's enough room for empathy for most of the characters.
No doubt. And I think the word complexity, I mean, there is no word that occurred to me more often while reading this book than that one. And if nothing else, this book demonstrates how complex this issue is, how complex criminal justice is, broadly speaking, why certain people become criminals, why certain people commit violent crimes. There is so much resistance in our culture to truly attempting to look at this stuff and to understand it deeply and to acknowledge its complexities. And I think maybe the reason why there is resistance is because to acknowledge the complexities of this stuff is to have to confront the humanity of it and to have to actually really grapple with it internally instead of just kind of taking a superficial look at the sensational aspects of it, assigning your verdict and carrying on with your day.
Right.
And I think that, I'll say it again, United States of America is one of the few countries in the world that routinely executes people.
Well, I'll add to that, we're currently the only country that officially has on its books as an option to sentence juveniles to die in prison. I mean, life without parole. We're the only ones. Where you're. I think what really strikes me about that is that that's saying that someone who's probably going to live maybe for 60 or 70 more years will never change. There is no chance of rehabilitating that person. They have no potential to transform or to contribute anything to society. There's nothing we can do. That's it. That person is done. They should die in prison. Now, if you say that about a kid, then what you're really saying is you don't believe in rehabilitation or change or the potential of any of us to evolve. I mean, essentially, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, or any of the fundamental teachings of Jesus, if you call yourself a Christian, as just one example. Like,
I see how you flipped that, Brad.
Hey, listen, there's so many, but I also have sympathy, especially for people who are survivors, whose family member has been killed. I'm not about to say that that's an easy equation for somebody.
No, of course not. Yeah.
If we're going to, so many people in this country like to think of this country as a Christian nation. And yet, if it was a truly Christian nation, I cannot believe that the death penalty would even be a thing. I cannot imagine that Jesus, were he here today, would be like, yeah, let's put some people into the electric chair. I can't imagine it. And so I'm no expert, but that seems like a pretty easy one.
It's definitely, there's a lot of course, at the moment, especially, we're at this peak moment of so-called pro-life rhetoric, right? On so many levels. And there are so many hypocrisies baked into that, and that's a whole other podcast. But, it's I think anytime you're talking about things in such extremes and you're not looking at the grays, you're not going to achieve justice in any given community. You're just not. It just makes your day flow a little more easily, like you were talking about before. We want to have this fantasy that, justice in this case is X. It's just always going to be X. And then you move on. And to actually acknowledge, for instance, that there are a lot of other people impacted by the sentencing of one individual. In Paula's situation, I thought so much about her sister Rhonda, who, by the way, had not spoken to the press for decades. And
Right.
I spent 3 years, like very patiently, very carefully, just, I don't, I want to do the right thing here. What's the right thing? We were finally connected through someone we both knew. Um, and she decided it was time to share her experiences. And I'm so glad she did, because, you know, the moment her sister was arrested, it was as if Rhonda had also committed the crime. Her friends dropped away. The rest of her family dropped away. The people in the church she was baptized in as a little girl no longer spoke to her, right? The press were harassing her and hounding her. And she now had a situation where, like, then when her sister's sentenced to death, she called Paula the love of her life, right? Every day she thought she was living with the possibility that her younger sister, was going to be executed. And I just don't think, I know I didn't think about that piece of the puzzle before working on this book. That there's potentially a small world of people who are also living with that sentence. And so the moment Bill reached out to Paula, he reached out to her grandfather, he reached out to Rhonda, he started seeing that there was this whole other side. And the system is just built in a way to keep those sides apart. And he started seeing that family as a family, just like his family, right? To me, that was, as simple as it sounds, it was a total revelation. I have to admit, I just had not thought about crime and punishment and justice that way. And in a way, there's this, there's a version of, you can look at this book almost like a triangle, because there's Bill and Paula's relationship, but then there's also Rhonda. And ultimately, Bill really wanted Rhonda to also trust him. And there's the book describes this whole journey for her of just being suspicious as hell of Bill Pelkey. Like, who is this older white guy who's calling up my family, writing to my sister, saying he wants to forgive? Who does that? That's crazy. He's got some motive. Like, he's going to take revenge in the prison visiting room, or like, who knows what this guy's up to? It's a trap. Like, there's just no way, And so it took ages for her to start to see him as a human being, so the layers of that for me were some of the most moving and fascinating parts of the book to write about.
Well, I think Rhonda, I'm so glad you brought her up, because for me, she was the most moving character in the whole book.
Oh, wow.
This is a young girl who basically functioned as a mother to Paula, because their mother Gloria was dealing with addiction and was not present in a multitude of ways. So she had to grow up fast. She had this younger sister she was trying to take care of. She was compartmentalizing and dealing with way more than a kid her age should ever have had to deal with. And then this murder happens. Her sister is convicted, placed on death row, and she is her only real family member advocate who's, I don't know, like really engaged. And I don't know,
And
my
she
heart.
was a kid at the time too. She was only a few years older, 19, I
Yeah,
believe.
yeah,
And when she got word that her sister had been arrested and was at the Gary police station, it was late at night. She had been partying because she was a teenager. And she described to me, she made herself some coffee. She put on some, like, serious looking clothes. She went to the police station and just assumed, well, this is like some kind of mess up that needs to be cleared up. So I'm going to go, my parents are going to be there, but I need to be there because I don't even trust my parents. What are they going to do for my sister? But it was on a night when she, you know what I mean? She was just doing normal teenage stuff.
right.
And it was the beginning of a totally, I mean, her life, she had no idea her life was about to change forever. Um, so there's, I talked to her about how now she feels finally, so much later in her life, uh, a little bit like the way she described her feeling these days. It's like something is finally lifting, and I don't know what it's taken. She wonders if maybe it's just that so much time has passed, but that maybe she feels a little like she can just kind of live like that young person again, because that period was cut so short, you
I
know?
mean, yeah, I hope so. I hope that for her so much, because no child, like no person, should have to deal with as much as she has had to deal with. But the fact that she was a child and dealing with so much of it, and demonstrating so much strength, you know, sometimes I think to her own detriment, the compartmentalization, the sort of emotional walls that she has had to put up just to survive. That's just too
Oh,
much.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, a period where she just would not make new friends. You know, she limited the amount of time she spent outside of the house. You know, there was a period where she felt so raw and exposed because of this. And she and her husband were able to, the guy she eventually married, who she met 2 weeks before the crime took place. So this guy, you know, he was a keeper if he stuck around,
No
you know.
doubt.
I
No
mean,
doubt.
seriously. So they moved to another city, but they eventually were drawn back to Gary, you know, back to Lake County. And she's finally made peace with forever being associated with this event. um she, you know, I think ultimately she thinks that a lot of the stress in her life and a lot of the harassment was, you know, clearly a direct result of publicly standing by her sister. You know, she could have rejected her sister, disowned her in some way because of what her sister had done, and but she has no regrets. She doesn't give it a second thought.
Hmm.
She doesn't give it a second thought, which is says a lot about her character, I think. She's also, I really would not cross Rhonda. She is a tough lady,
I
and
bet.
was I'm proud to know her.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, she's again, my heart broke for her reading about her, and just the endurance that it would take to kind of get through all that she's had to get through. And, there's so much in this book that there's no possible way for us to get to it all. People will have to read it to really have the full experience. But a couple things I want to say, or I wanted, us to talk about before I let you go is, first of all, I want to say that as a reader, something that occurred to me as I was thinking about Bill Pelkey and the journey and all of these abolitionists who travel the world advocating for an end to the death penalty, is that, as you've probably gleaned, I am not in favor of the death penalty. I count myself as a person who thinks it should be done away with. I do believe there need to be harsh penalties for harsh crimes. I do believe there needs to be justice, but I don't think that this state should be in the business of killing, and I don't think that we should kill to show that killing is wrong. Having said that, what this book forced me to admit to myself is that even though that is my position, I'm not doing much to advocate for the commutation of sentences of people who are currently on death row. And I know you can't do everything for everyone. You have to sort of pick your moments politically and as an advocate. But that occurs to me, and maybe not entirely comfortably. Like that's something your book made me think about, is the fact that, yeah, I have this position. I try to vote for people who share this position, but I'm not a Bill Pelkey. I'm not out there in my press suit with my Bible. If I'm not a practicing Christian either, but you know what I mean. I'm not out there walking the walk like Sister Helen Prejean, who makes an appearance in this book, and who I think listeners may be familiar with as the nun in Dead Man Walking. That character,
Right.
Susan Sarandon portrayed Sister Helen. So I don't know. That was just something that occurred to me, and I guess a question for you is, having spent so many years with this and having gotten to know all these people and having written this book, how did it change you, and where do you stand?
Wow. Well, I'll say, you know, I I really deliberately wrote this book not as an advocate of one position or another, but, you know, with the conviction that once you know enough facts about the death penalty and how it works as a part of the system, that you'll understand that it is a broken piece of our system. You can, even if you're in favor of some kind of death sentence, it doesn't work that way. There's an idea that somehow there's a way to have a clean execution in this country. I mean, it's bizarre. Like we think that there's some way in which this is somehow like there's a version of this where if you're in favor of the death sentence, it's functional. It doesn't provide what it promises to. There's no closure for the families of the victims. Sometimes it re-traumatizes them. It re-traumatizes the families of the person convicted. It costs way more money than sentencing someone to a long prison sentence and so on. Me personally, I don't think, as you just said, that's kind of a classic line in abolitionist circles. Why do we kill people to show that killing people is wrong? It makes no sense to me. And the criminal justice system, and hopefully the way I describe someone like Jack Crawford really illustrates this. It is made up of human beings. We are all flawed. There are no gods in our system. You look at the way the Supreme Court right now is making press. I think we're all extremely aware that not even at the highest levels of our system do we have anyone who approaches even like a demigod status. I mean, these are flawed human beings who have biases. They just do. I've met multiple people at this point who were innocent and were on death row for years and years. In one case, more than 20 years before they were exonerated. Why do we want to put that level of faith in a system run by other human beings?
Well, yeah. And how many people have been executed who were innocent? We have to. I mean, that's a terrible thing to consider.
Yeah, we'll never know. I mean, we will never know the answer to that. But the number of exonerated, I believe, is in the high 400s now. That's a lot of people. It could be higher. That I kind of knew that going in. I think, though, this changed me in terms of thinking about, the family on either side in a much more vivid way. I really had fallen into that trap of seeing the defendant as somehow like this lone figure, and it's not, like on either side is a piece. There's a slice of your community on either side in any courtroom for any case. And that's a lot to think about. And we need to be willing to embrace the complexity of that.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. I think that's what this book does. And I think that I'm better for having read it, even though I need to lie down in the fetal position for.
I told Rhonda after one of our interviews, I said, okay, well now I'm gonna take a really super long nap because I'm so exhausted.
Yeah.
So it's all right, it's all right. It's a lot to be confronted with, to immerse yourself in, and that's a good thing.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a necessary endeavor, and it's something that we should grapple with. And again, there's much we did not touch upon. This is a big story. It's a human story. It runs really deep, and it's very tragic. And I congratulate you on seeing it through. I have to believe it was a long process with a lot of ups and downs. And I always ask my guests, and it feels especially cruel today. I always ask my guests if they're working on anything else, and I'm going to do it. But I want to.
Of course, though.
Are
Brad,
you?
Of course.
There's another.
I mean, are you kidding me? After 5 years on almost exclusively on one project, I'm literally ready to run into the arms of the next thing. And
okay.
And I think for the first time, I want to work on two at once, two very different projects at once. Rather than, going down one enormous rabbit hole. but I don't have anything to talk about yet. But I think something that was a huge shift for me with this book was there was a lot of my voice and the first person in my first book, Witches of America. And that was appropriate because I was spending time with these different communities, the different pagan communities, occult communities, and exploring a new religious movement, right? And I wanted to be honest about that from a first person perspective. I tried some of that in the early stages of this book, but the material just kept kicking me out of the room, because it just speaks for itself in such a powerful way. Why do I need to have like the hubris of inserting myself? But I miss the looseness and the freedom of that kind of prose writing. And so I think some of that, that's going to rear its head again with my next nonfiction project.
Like the first person is, you're going to get back into
Yeah,
that.
I think so. I think for sure. There's also the sense of wanting to write about things that I'm experiencing in the moment, and I am, my experience makes me an instant expert. I am the one to, describe this. I am here, going back in time to the 80s. I mean, it's a heavy lift. It takes so much effort to conjure up that time with any detail and any confidence and accuracy. So I think now I need to be able to shake that off and just say, okay, what I see, I'm allowed to write about as me, and it's fascinating. Like nonfiction just has that kind of, it's a lot of different animals at once. So I think I'm going to be, a different version of myself with the next one.
And it's not like the topic of the book that you are thinking of working on is related or unrelated to capital punishment. Is it in any way connected?
Oh, unrelated. I'm not, I came at this not as some, I'm interested in social justice as a human being, but I didn't come at this book as someone who writes about issues. I came at it through the human story at the center of it. And honestly, like for me, it's about belief, right? It's the conviction that you're right. And why is that? And when do you choose to question that? Like for instance, Bill did. And sometimes it's built on faith. Sometimes it's built on the letter of the law. But yeah, that's kind of a through line, I think, in my work, whether it's explicitly about religion or it's a little more complicated, as in this story. So that's what drew me in. And I'm sure that those kinds of themes will be part of whatever's next.
Well, whatever it is, I wish you well on it. And congrats again on this book and all the work that you put into it. It's a big achievement.
Thank you, Brad. This was fun.